مساء الخير أعزائي
Good afternoon
المستمعين
to
والمشاهدين
our dear
والأصدقاء
audience
الذين
and to all of
يتابعون
our
هذه
listeners and
الجلسة
friends
النقاشية التي
who are here with us
ينظمها
for this
مركز
discussion
صنعاء
session, a session
للدراسات
that is being
الاستراتيجية
organized by
بالتعاون
the Sana
مع
Center for
مركز
Strategic Studies
الدراسات
in
العربية
cooperation with the
اليوراسية.
Eurasian
أرحب
Studies Center.
بجميع
I would
الذين
like to welcome
يشاركوننا
all of the
في هذه
participants who are here
الجلسة.
with us in
أرحب
this session.
بضيوفي
I would like to
في
welcome
البداية
our
الأستاذة
dear
ميساء
guests and
شجاع
speakers.
الدين
I would like to
الباحث
start
الأول
with
في
Mesa
مركز
Shujaa al-Din, a
صنعاء.
senior
أهلا بك
researcher
يا
at the
أستاذة
Sana Center for
ميساء.
Strategic
أرحب
Studies. Welcome,
أيضا
Mesa. I would also
بالأستاذ
like to welcome
ميخائيل ياكوشيف
Mikhail Yakushev,
المستشرق الروسي
who is a
والدبلوماسي
former
الروسي
Russian
السابق الذي
diplomat and
ينضم إلينا
expert on
من
Eurasian
العاصمة
affairs. He is
الروسية
joining us from the
موسكو.
Russian
أرحب
capital, Moscow.
بالأستاذ
I would also
حسام
like to welcome
ردمان
Hussam
الباحث
Radman,
في
a
مركز
researcher at the
صنعاء.
Sana Center for
أهلا بك يا
Strategic
أستاذ
Studies.
حسام.
Welcome, Hussam, and thank you for
ونرحب
joining us.
بالأستاذ
And
أحمد
last but
دهشان
not least, I would
الزميل
like to welcome my
والصديق رئيس
colleague
تحرير
and
مركز
friend
الدراسات
Ahmed
العربية
Dahshan, who is
الدراسية. هذه
the
الجلسة
editor-in-chief
التي
for the
كما
Center
ذكرت
for
لحضراتكم
Arab-Eurasian Studies. This session,
تأتيكم
like I've mentioned,
بتنظيم من مركز صناعة
is
للدراسات
organized or
الاستراتيجية بالتعاون
facilitated
مع
by the
مركز
Sana
الدراسات
Center for
العربية
Strategic Studies in
اليوراسية.
cooperation with the Center for
عنوان هذه
Arab-Eurasian
الجلسة
Studies.
هو
The title of our
الموقف
session today
الروسي من
is
أزمة
Russia's
البحر
position on
الأحمر أو
the
الدور
Red
الروسي
Sea
في
crisis, or the
الخليج
Russian role
والبحر الأحمر. طبعا
in the Gulf and the
الموضوع
Red Sea.
موضوع مهم،
This is a very
وربما
important and
نحن
timely topic,
يعني في إطار التعاون مع مركز صنعاء
and
للدراسات
in our
الاستراتيجية
cooperation with the Sana
كان لنا
Center for
لقاء
Strategic
في
Studies,
وقت
we
سابق
conducted a
واتفقنا على هذا
meeting
الموضوع نظرا
previously and
لأن
agreed that this would be the
الأحداث
topic of our
الجارية
discussion today because
والمتعلقة
developments
بالحرب
are
في
very
غزة
very
لها
close. Those
تداعيات
linked
على
with the war
أصعدة
in Gaza will
عديدة،
have implications or
ربما من
repercussions on
أهمها
several
صعيد
levels,
أمن
with the
البحر
most important
الأحمر.
of these
كيف
potentially
تتفاعل
being more
هذه
focus on Red Sea
الأزمة مع
security and how
تداعيات
this
هذه
crisis
الحرب على
interacts with
أمن
other
الملاحة في البحر
regional
الأحمر،
topics and
على
crises, and what impact will
مواقف
this have?
الدول
What will the
المهتمة
shipping crisis through the Red Sea
بهذه
have?
القضية، قضية
What impact it
الأمن
will
في
have on
البحر
this,
الأحمر.
on the
بالتأكيد
regional actors involved.
من الدول التي
One
لا
of the
تنفصل
actors or the
أزمات
countries
المنطقة
that is
منذ
very
عشرات
closely linked to
السنين،
the
منذ أن
crises
كانت تسمى
of
بالاتحاد السوفيتي
in the
روسيا.
region
روسيا لا
for
تنفصل بأي حال
decades,
من الأحوال
Russia
عن
has always been very
أزمات
close to what's happening in the
المنطقة
region.
كما ذكرت، سواء في العهد السوفيتي أو
Like I said,
بعد
whether
انهيار
this was during
الاتحاد
the Soviet
السوفيتي.
Union or after the collapse
روسيا
of the
ينظر
Soviet Union,
إليها
Russia
من قبل
has always
كثيرين
been seen, or by
كدولة
many people, as
قوية لها
a
مصالح في المنطقة،
superpower that
لها
has its own
علاقات مع
interests in the region,
أطراف
that has
عديدة في
relations
المنطقة.
and engagement with
روسيا
several
رغم
actors in
انشغالها
the region.
في
And
حرب
Russia, despite
أوكرانيا، أو
it being
بمعنى
preoccupied
أدق
with the Ukraine war,
بالصراع
or
مع الغرب
more
على
precisely in
الساحة
the conflict
الأوكرانية،
with the
لا
West
تزال
and
لا
Ukraine,
يزال ينظر إليها كلاعب
it is
مهم
still seen
في
as a
أزماتها
dominant or
الإقليمية. كيف
important actor in the
ينظر
crises
الروس
occurring in the
وينظر
region.
موسكو
How
إلى
does
هذه
Russia, or
الأزمة؟
how
ما
does
هي
Moscow
علاقة
view this
موسكو
crisis, and what is Moscow's
بجماعة أنصار
relationship
الله
with Ansar Allah,
الحوثيين؟
also known as the Houthis?
أيضا ما علاقتها ببقية
And
القوى
what is the relationship between
اليمنية
Russia and the other
والإقليمية؟ وأنا
Yemeni
أقصد
and
تحديدا هنا
regional actors?
طبعا
And I
أحد
mean
اللاعبين
specifically
الكبار
one
في
of the
المنطقة
one of
وهو
the
إيران،
main actors in the region,
دول
which is
الخليج،
Iran, as well as the
وكذلك
Gulf countries
إسرائيل.
and
طبعا
Israel.
أنتم تعلمون جميعا
As we all know,
بأنه بعد أن بدأت الحرب في غزة،
after the
بعد أن
war in
بدأ
Gaza started,
هجوم 7 أكتوبر،
and after the attacks on the 7th
ما
of
تبع
October,
ذلك الهجوم من
the developments that
إدخال
occurred
إسرائيل حرب على قطاع
included
غزة،
Israel waging a war
بدأت
on the
هناك
Gaza Strip,
تفاعلات في
and
الإقليم في
engagement
المنطقة.
started in the
من أهم
region
هذه
and
التفاعلات
in the area, the most important
قيام
of which
جماعة أنصار
was
الله في
Ansar
اليمن
Allah in Yemen,
بمهاجمة إسرائيل
carrying out
بصواريخ بمسيرات،
attacks on Israel using
وأيضا
ballistic
استهداف
missiles and
للسفن
drones, as well as
في
targeting
البحر الأحمر، السفن
vessels passing through the
التجارية
Red Sea.
التي
And these were commercial vessels
تتوجه كما يعني يقول
uh,
الحوثيون
that,
تتوجه
as claimed by the
إلى إسرائيل
Houthis, were
تمر من
heading
باب
towards
المندب
Israel
جنوب
and passing through
البحر
the Bab
الأحمر.
el-Mandeb Strait to the
هذه
south of the Red Sea.
التفاعلات وهذه الأحداث وهذا
These
الاستهداف
developments and this targeting
خلق أزمة
has
ليس
created or has
فقط
led
أزمة أمنية
to a
ولكن أيضا
crisis, not just
أزمة اقتصادية لا
not just a
سيما
political or
فيما
military
يتعلق
crisis, but
بحركة
also an
التجارة
economic
العالمية
crisis
التي
with the
انخفضت
effect that it has had
للنصف في
on
عدد
international
السفن
shipping,
التي
with the
تسلك
number of
هذا الطريق
vessels
طريق
going through
البحر
this
الأحمر
route
عبر
going
باب
down to half
المندب من
of
شرق
the
آسيا
number of vessels
لأوروبا
that used to
وأوروبا
pass
آسيا
through it
وشمال
from
أفريقيا. ربما
different
نحن
parts of the world.
في مصر تأثرنا
Oh, I think
تأثرا
we in
كبيرا
Egypt have been
بما يجري
significantly
في
affected
البحر
by what's
الأحمر
happening in the Red Sea
نتيجة اعتمادنا
as a
أو اعتماد
result
الاقتصاد
of
المصري
the
بشكل
Egyptian
كبير
economy
على
relying to a large extent
الدخل الذي
on the
تدره
income and
قناة
revenue
السويس من
from the
عمق
Suez
صعب.
Canal.
لا أريد أن أتحدث طويلا لكن أريد
I
أن
don't
أنوه
want to take
لأن
too long
هذه
for the
الحلقة
introduction, but I
النقاشية
wanted to inform everyone that
تأتيكم
this
مترجمة باللغة
webinar is going
الإنجليزية
to
في
be
تطبيق زوم
simultaneously interpreted
وكذلك تأتيكم طبعا
into English, both Arabic and English, on
بثها
Zoom,
يأتيكم بثها
and there will be a
المباشر
live
على
broadcast of the
المنصات
session
جميعا فيسبوك يوتيوب
on
ومنصة
Facebook,
إكس
YouTube,
تويتر
and
سابقا.
X,
والترحيب
formerly Twitter.
بضيوفي
I would like to
وزملائي
welcome
في
the
هذه
panelists and our
الحلقة.
colleagues in this session,
وربما
as well as
يعني
the
كما
audience. To start,
يعني يتعين علينا حتى يعني في
I,
الحياة بشكل عام أن نعطي الفرصة دائما
I think we should
للجنس
start with
اللطيف. أستاذة ميساء وكما يقال باللغة
Mesa,
الإنجليزية ladies first. يعني أريد أن
because
أبدأ
we believe in
معك
ladies first. So let's start with
لتعطينا
Mesa. If you
يعني
could please give us
نبذة ربما
a brief
عن
overview
أثر أو عن قراءتك. دعينا نبدأ
of your
بقراءتك
analysis
الخاصة لما
or your
يجري من
perspective on
تصعيد
what's
عسكري
happening with
في
the
البحر
military
الأحمر.
escalation in the Red Sea.
تعطينا أيضا تقييم
If you could also please give us your
توقع
assessment
أنصار الله من
of
هذا
what are Ansar Allah's
التصعيد.
motivations.
ماذا
What are
تريد
they
جماعة
hoping to
أنصار
achieve
الله؟
through this
إلى ماذا
escalation?
تطمح؟
What are their
ما هي
objectives? What are their
أهدافها؟ تفضل.
aspirations? Over to you, Mesa.
أولا
Thank
شكرا
you.
جزيلا أستاذ
Thank you
عمرو
very
وشكرا
much,
لجميع
Amr, for
الحاضرين.
the introduction and for
بالنسبة
moderating the
لأنصار
session. I would
الله
also like to thank
والحوثيين
the audience for
فهم
being here. With regards to
طبعا
Ansar
منذ
Allah or the
التصعيد هم
Houthis,
بدأوا التصعيد منذ بداية
since
حرب غزة
the escalation, their escalation
وعمليا
started with the
عبد
beginning
الملك
of the Gaza
الحوثي
war. Abdul
في
Malik
أول خطاب
al-Houthi,
له بعد حرب غزة كان
in the
بعد
first
عدة أيام
speech that he gave
وغزة
after the Gaza
كان
war,
تحدث
it
عن
was a few days
تنسيق
after the
بينه
beginning, he
وبين
spoke about the
فصائل
coordination
المقاومة
between himself or his group
وتكلم عنها
and the
بشكل مباشر
various
كان
actors
عادة
within the
فيما
axis
سبق
of
حرب غزة
resistance. And he spoke about this
يميل
directly. But before the
إلى
Gaza war,
عدم ذكر
he
إيران
had preferred to
وعدم ذكر
not
محور
mention Iran
المقاومة
and to not mention the axis of resistance in his
والتأكيد على إن في
speeches and
مسافة ما
statements.
بينه وبينهم
And he would always, or he seemed to
فكان من
reiterate that
الملفت
there was a
أن بداية
distance
حرب غزة
between
بدأ
the
يذكر
Houthis and the axis
ارتباطا
of
بهذا
resistance. And
المحور
so after the beginning of the Gaza war,
فهو
he
منذ
started to mention
البداية
more and
خرج في
more
هذا
his
الحرب بداية
the relationship with the
بقصف
axis of
إسرائيل
resistance. And so
بالصواريخ
they
واللي كانت
started
الصواريخ يعني غير
their
قاصرة وغير
involvement
فعالة
with
بسبب بعد
missile attacks on
المسافة
Israel, which were not very
وصعوبة
effective because
دقة
of the
الاستهداف
distance and the difficulty
لكن
in
المرحلة
precisely targeting
التصعيد
anything
الثانية
at that
التي كان
distance for the
أعلنها في
Houthis.
نوفمبر
The second stage of
الماضي
the
هي
escalation, which was
كانت عمليا
announced in
بداية
November of
التصعيد
last
الثاني
year,
كانت
was the
تحدث
real
وقتها عن
beginning of
استهداف
escalation in the
السفن
Red Sea.
المتجهة
They spoke
لإسرائيل
about targeting vessels that were
وحينها
heading towards Israel.
تم اختطاف سفينة
And
جالاكسي
at the
ليدرز
time,
التي هي لا زالت محتجزة لديهم حتى الآن
they took
ومن
over the
بعد
Galaxy
التصعيد
Leader
مرحلة
vessel,
التصعيد
which is
الثاني
still
هو
being
أعلن عن
detained.
3
And
مراحل
after the second
مرحلة في
phase of
مارس
the escalation, he
تكلم فيها عن
announced three
تصعيد
stages. The
يمتد
first,
إلى البحر
the
العربي
third occurred
والهندي
in
ومن ثم
March, with the
مرحلة في
escalation
مايو
expanding
يتحدث فيها
to
عن
the Arabian
تصعيد
Sea and the Indian Ocean.
يعني سوف
And then
يتجه
the
إلى
next stage
الاستهداف
started in May of this year, in
البحر
which
الأبيض
they
المتوسط
announced that they would be targeting vessels
وأخيرا
in the
المرحلة
Mediterranean.
الأخيرة هي كانت في
And the
يوليو
final
الماضي
stage was in
في
July,
19 يوليو الماضي
on the
كان يتحدث فيها
19th
عن
of
تصعيد
July,
لتل
when
أبيب والتي
he
سوف
announced that there
يصاروها
will
تل
be
أبيب وردا
escalation in
عليه
targeting
إسرائيل
Tel Aviv
باستهداف
using a
سفينة
drone
الجندي
attack, with
طبعا
Israel responding by
التصعيد في
targeting
المحيط
Hodeidah
الهندي أو
port.
الأماكن البعيدة البحر
The
الأبيض المتوسط
escalation in
لا
the
شيء
Indian
مؤثر أو
Ocean and the
فعال
Mediterranean has not been as
المهم
effective.
هنا
But
إنه
what's
الحوثي
important
أولا
here is that
ارتباطها
the Houthis
الإقليمي هو
first
أكيد
have
لعب دور
very
أساسي
clear
لكن لا
regional
يمكن
ties,
أن
and I think
ننسى
this has played a very
إنه
important
أيديولوجيا
role in their actions.
الحوثيين
But
منذ
also
البداية
ideologically, the Houthis
يقع
since the very beginning,
العداء لأمريكا وإسرائيل تقع في
have
صميم
very
أو في
clear,
قلب
or the
أيديولوجية
animosity towards
منذ
America
البداية،
and
وهي موجودة
Israel
في
has been a
شعارهم،
very core
وهي
part of their
مسألة
ideology.
سهل
It's a part
التحديث
of their
فيها،
slogan,
وهي
and it's something that
اليمنيين
is
عامة
very
كالشعب
easy to
أيضا
use to mobilize and recruits. And Yemenis in
يشعر
general
بالتعاطف عادة مع
do not have,
الفلسطينيين بشكل
have
عام
always felt
بغض
sympathy
النظر
for the
طبعا في
Palestinian cause,
الانقساماتهم،
regardless of all of
إضافة
the divisions
ارتباطاتها
within the
الإقليمية
country,
التي
in
كانت
addition to
موجودة
its
وحاضرة،
regional ties, which have
وهي
also played an
لتحدث
important
ضمن
role
تنسيق
in
في
these decisions.
ارتباطاتها
And this
الإقليمية
occurs
في هذا
as a
الجانب.
part of the coordination
ماذا
with the regional
يريدون؟
allies and the
طبعا
Axis.
دائما سقف
With
الأهداف
regards to what their
متحرك،
objective is, I think the
لكن
objectives are
المعلن منذ
always
البداية
constantly
هو
moving,
رفع
but what has
الحصار
been
عن
announced since
قطاع
the beginning
غزة
is the
ووقف
lifting of
الحرب.
the siege on the Gaza Strip
لكن حاليا
and an
مؤخرا
end to
صار
the war.
الحديث
But
عن
recently,
الثأر
they
والانتقام
have also
وفكرة
talked about
الرد
taking
على ما
revenge and
حدث من
responding
استهداف القيادات،
for
بعض
the
القيادات من بينهم
targeting
إسماعيل هنية.
of leaders
ربما
within the
صار
axis of
طاغي أكثر.
resistance, including Ismail Haniyeh, and I think
المهلك
this
في
has
هذا
become
العملية
more of an
أنه
important objective. But what
استهداف
is
البحر
worrying about
الأحمر
this
صار
operation is that
يأخذ
targeting of the
مجرى
Red Sea or
كأزمة
vessels in the Red
مستديمة.
Sea seems to be turning
فصارت
into a
لها
permanent
دوافعها
crisis.
الخاصة
And so it
بها،
has
يعني
its
صارت
own
الحرب
motivations
بدفع ذاتي.
internally, its own internal engines.
من خلال هذا الدفع الذاتي مع مرور الوقت
And
حتبدأ
during this,
الأسباب الرئيسية أو
and
الأسباب
over time,
الفعلية
the main
لانطلاقة الأزمة
reasons
تبدأ
or the
تنتهي
actual
أو
reasons for
تصبح
the beginning
الخير
of
غير
this
مهدد.
crisis will start to disappear, will
وكل ما
become
طالت
an
الأزمة كل ما
unimportant
صارت
side
أكثر
note.
صعوبة
The
من
longer
إنك
this crisis
توقفها،
goes on, the
لأنها
more difficult it
الحوثي
will be to
حاليا
stop, because the
اكتشف
Houthis now have
أهمية الموقع
discovered
البحري
the
لليمن،
importance of the
وهذا
Yemen's
أمر
location.
مع حركة جبلية، يعني حركة
And this
جاءت
is
من
this is
الجبال،
important for them, especially as
لم
a
تتعامل
movement
مع
that started in
البحار
mountainous
أصلا،
region from mountainous
وعلاقتها
regions in
بالبحر
Yemen, one that did
ضعيفة،
not have
ولم
a
ترث
very close
والجيش
relationship
اليمني الذي
with
ورثت
the
كثير من
coastal
مشكلاته
areas.
لم يكن
And the Yemeni
جيش
military, which
بحريا،
the Houthis inherited much of
جيش
its
قوي أصلا.
capabilities, was not very strong when
فبالتالي
it came
هذا
to its naval
الاكتشاف
forces.
هو مهم جدا
And
لهم،
so this discovery is very important for the
والجماعة
Houthis.
لديها شهية
And the
إقليمية، هي
group,
لا
I
ترى
think,
نفسها
has an
كجماعة
appetite to
محلية، هي
play
ترى
more of a
نفسها
role
كجماعة
as a regional
إقليمية
actor. They don't
ولديها
see themselves
طموحات
as a
إقليمية.
local actor, and they have
فهذه
regional
مسألة
aspirations.
ممكن نضعها بعين
And so this
الاعتبار
is an
دائما
issue that we can
ونحن
always take
نشاهد
into
الوضع في البحر
account
الأحمر.
when observing or monitoring the situation in the Red Sea. Thank you.
شكرا أستاذة
Thank you very much,
ميساء.
Mesa.
طيب، ما دام العنوان الرئيسي
And
لهذه
so,
الندوة
based on
النقاشية
the
الموقف
title of our
الروسي
session
لأزمة
today about the Russian
البحر
position or
الأحمر
Russia's position
والدور الروسي
towards
في
the
الخليج
Red Sea
وفي حول
crisis and
البحر
Russia's
الأحمر،
role in the Gulf
أوجه
and the Red Sea
بالسؤال
regions, I would like to ask a
للصديق
question
العزيز
to
الأستاذ
our dear friend,
ميخائيل
Mr.
ياكوشيف في
Mikhail Yakushev.
موسكو. أستاذ ميخائيل، يعني
Mr.
لو
Mikhail,
تعطينا
could you
نبذة
please
في
give us an
البداية
overview in the beginning
عن موقف روسيا
on Russia's
أولا
position,
من
first
حرب
and foremost,
غزة،
towards the Gaza
كيف
war,
ترى موسكو
how
العدوان
Moscow
الإسرائيلي
views the
على
Israeli
فلسطين في
aggression against
غزة، ومن
Palestinians in
ثم
Gaza, and secondly,
يعني نربط هذا الموقف إن كان
if we could
هناك
try to
مجال
link
للربط
this,
طبعا
if there is any
بما
room for it to
يجري
be
من
linked to what is happening
استهدافات يقوم بها
in the
الحوثيون أو جماعة
targeting of
أنصار الله
vessels by the Houthis or Ansar Allah
للملاحة
in the
الدولية
Red
في
Sea.
البحر الأحمر، تداعيات ذلك على أمن
What
هذه
implications do you think this will
المنطقة.
have
تفضل.
on the security of the region? Over to you.
الصوت
Your
عندك
microphone seems
مغلق
to
يا
be
أستاذ
muted.
ميخائيل.
If you could please unmute yourself.
ما زال مغلقا.
You're still muted.
يعني كده تمام.
Okay, now we can hear. I'm sorry. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to start off by saying that what happened in the Middle East after the 7th of October has made Russia view the Middle East or the whole region from a different perspective or through a different lens, because Moscow has always defended the Palestinian cause and the Arab cause, as well as the peace process which started in Madrid of 1991. And Russia's position has always been to defend the Arab position, especially the Palestinian position in this process.
ما جعلت إسرائيل تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني
when Moscow saw the response by Israel towards the Palestinian people, I think that this has
موقف روسيا تجاه إسرائيل
changed Russia's position towards Israel,
حتى منذ عدة أشهر كان هناك توازن
because
في العلاقات
even
فيما بين
a few months ago there was a balance in the
بالنسبة
relationship
لإسرائيل
when it came
كان
to
هناك 50
Israel.
50
It
روسيا
was around the
وأوكرانيا
50-50 of
والآن
Russia and Ukraine. But after
بعد 7 أكتوبر
the balance of the Israeli
لاحظنا
position
أنه
towards Russia and Ukraine. But after the
موقف
7th of October,
إسرائيل
we've noticed
تغير
that
تماما
Israel's
جذريا
position has completely
وأصبحت
changed
يعني
at its
تدافع
core, and it
أوكرانيا
has started to defend
الحرب في
Ukraine.
أوكرانيا بشدة وبقوة
It has
ولذلك
started to
أنا
defend Ukraine
لاحظت
very strongly. And so
بعض
I've
التغييرات
noticed
في
that there
الموقف
have been
الروسي
some
تجاه
changes in the Russian position
هذه
towards
الأزمة
this
وتجاه
crisis
إسرائيل
and towards
ف
Israel.
عفوا يا أستاذ.
I'm sorry,
عفوا
Mr. Mikhail, but
يعني الموقف الروسي
the Russian position
تغير
or the
كما
Russian stance
تفضلت
has changed, as you've said.
أصبح
It has become,
يعني ربما أبعد
it has
عن
possibly
موقف إسرائيل
become
أو
a bit
أصبح
further
ضد
away
موقف
from the Israeli
إسرائيل
position
في
or
غزة.
opposed to it, opposed to the
هل
Israeli
سبب
stance
ذلك
or
كما
position on
أشرت
Gaza? Is
يعود
the reason
إلى
for this, as you've said,
أنه إسرائيل تدعم
due to the fact
أوكرانيا
that
ضد
Israel is
روسيا
supporting Ukraine
أم
against
هو
Russia,
مجرد
or is
موقف
it
مبدئي للقيادة
or
الروسية
is
أو
it a
لموسكو
position,
بشكل عام؟
a principled position for the Russian leadership and for
أظن أنه
Moscow?
هذا أصبح موقف مبدئي
I think
لأنه
that it is a
موسكو
principled position
بعد
because
التسعينات
Moscow, after the
حاولت أن
1990s,
تحتفظ علاقات
tried to
جيدة مع
maintain
إسرائيل
good
وكانت
ties
تفكر في
or
أن
good
إسرائيل
relations with Israel, and it viewed
صديق
Israel as a friend
لدولة روسيا
and
ومع سير
as a
الزمن
friend of
خصوصا
Russia. But
بعد
over
بدء
time, and especially after
العملية العسكرية الخاصة في
the beginning
أوكرانيا
of the special
لاحظنا أن
military
إسرائيل
operation in Ukraine,
موالية
we've noticed
لأوكرانيا
that Israel is more aligned with
فهذا
Ukraine.
الشيء جعل
And so
يعني
this has made
جعل موقف روسيا
Russia's position
أكثر تأييدا
more supportive
للموقف العربي
of
في
the
هذه
Arab
الأزمة
position
طب
in
إذا
this
كانت عفوا
crisis.
إذا كانت
I'm
إسرائيل
sorry to
وقفت
interrupt
مع
once again,
روسيا
but
ضد
if
أوكرانيا
Israel had
هل
been
كان
with Russia
هل كانت
against Ukraine,
ستقف موسكو مع العرب
would Moscow
ضد
have supported the Arab position
إسرائيل
against
في هذه
Israel
المعركة الحالية في الحرب
in this
الحالية في
ongoing
غزة؟
battle,
أنا
in the ongoing
أتذكر
battle?
أنا من جيل قديم
I'm from an older generation, and so
فأتذكر
I
أن موقف
remember that
الاتحاد السوفيتي
the
كانت دائما
Soviet
يعني
Union always took a
تدعم
position that was supportive
الموقف
of
العربي والقضية
the Arab
الفلسطينية
position and
ضد
the
إسرائيل.
Palestinian cause
أما
against
الآن
Israel. But now
روسيا أصبحت
Russia has become
جعلت تحتفظ علاقات مع
has
جميع
maintained
الأطراف
ties with
المعنية
all
في
of
هذه
the
الأزمة.
actors, with all
وهذا
of the
شيء
different
يعني
actors involved in this crisis.
نسبيا
And
أنا
so
لا أظن
this,
أنه هذه الموقف الروسي كانت
I don't think that this Russian position has
سليم.
been
بالنسبة لي أنا
was suitable, at least for myself
لأنه أنا
personally,
اشتغلت 5 سنوات في إسرائيل
because I
ورأيت
worked
أن
for 5 years in Israel, and I saw that
هناك علاقات إسرائيل
and I
مع
saw that
مثلا
Israel's
الولايات
ties with, for
المتحدة
example, the United States
وبريطانيا
and with the United
والدول
Kingdom
الغربية
and
وأوكرانيا
other Western states, as well as Ukraine,
أحسن بكثير
was
مما
much closer to
كونها بالاتحاد السوفيتي.
than its ties with
وبعد
the Soviet Union.
سقوط الاتحاد السوفيتي انهيار
After the
الاتحاد
fall, after the
السوفيتي
collapse of the
لاحظنا
Soviet
أن
Union, we
روسيا
noticed
كانت
that
تحاول أن تبني
Russia
علاقاتها
tried
مع إسرائيل
to build ties with
بشكل
Israel,
مستمر وجيد. فهذا
and
الأمر
these
كان
efforts
يعني
continued,
مفرح
and I think they
بالنسبة
were
لي لأن
positive, but it was
سياسة
surprising for me because
إسرائيل كان مفهومة
Israel's
سياسة
policy was very well
عدوانية
understood. It was a very
ومعادية
hostile policy, one that was
للمعادية
against.
الإسلامية.
طيب وبالتالي هل يمكن القول
And so
بأنه
can we say
موقف
that
روسيا
that
من أمن
Russia's
الملاحة
position
في البحر الأحمر أو
towards
مما
the
يجري في
security
البحر
of
الأحمر هو
shipping
أقرب
routes in the Red
لموقف
Sea or the Red
الحوثيين،
Sea crisis
هو
in general is
تأييد لما
closer
يحوثه
to the Houthi
الحوثيون
position, that it is
في
supportive
البحر الأحمر؟
of what the Houthis are doing in the
أولا
Red Sea?
بعد هذه الأزمة
Well,
بعد
first,
7 أكتوبر
after this
لاحظت
crisis,
أن
after the
موسكو
7th
كانت
of October, I've
تترقب
noticed that
الموقف
Moscow
الشجاع
was monitoring,
مؤيد للقضية الفلسطينية من جميع الدول العربية.
was
كانت
expecting a brave
تنتظر
position, one that was supportive
ولكن
of the Palestinian
بدفاع
cause
عن
from all
إسرائيل،
Arab
ولكن
states, and so it
لم
waited
يحصل
very
شيئا.
patiently for this position to
وكان
be taken
هناك
by the Arab states,
فإذا
but none of it happened.
أنصار الله
And
الحوثيون،
the Ansar Allah,
فهذا
the
كان
Houthis,
اكتشاف
I think this was a discovery with what they have done. This was a significant discovery for Russia to find that this group is the one that is defending the Palestinian cause and doing so very bravely at the time when there was silence from all of the Arab states when it came to Israel, especially after the destruction of the mosques and the churches in Gaza. I have not heard a single voice against this policy, and there was silence on that matter. But when Moscow saw, or when the Russian people saw this policy, saw this bravery by the Houthis, the hearts of the Russian people were with this Yemeni Shi'i group and supportive of it in its actions. And this stance has remained until now, because when I hear people talk on the streets, for example, who are the Houthis? When we ask who are the Houthis or who are Ansar Allah, I see that there is a lot of focus on this topic on who the Houthis are, and then not just, but even at the popular level, and not just among the political elites. I think that the Russian government in Moscow now understand or recognize the importance of this movement, because what has happened in the Red Sea, even economically and militarily, has helped Russia with its special military operation in Ukraine. I'm sorry, Mr. Mikhail, I wanted to intervene here. You're saying that the Russian position is a position that is one of admiration for what the Houthis are doing, and that it is very close to the Houthis. But you know that there is a internationally recognized government in Yemen, one that represents Yemenis at the international level, in the United Nations, and all around the world. Yemeni embassies are under the control of this internationally recognized government. And so, is this a contradiction from the Russians, from the Kremlin, to support a group that is not internationally recognized when there is a legitimate or internationally recognized government? No, because Moscow, as you know, yesterday there were negotiations between the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, and his Yemeni counterpart, Mr. Shaya Zandani. And so during these discussions and these dialogues were very fruitful, and there was reiteration that by the Minister of Foreign Affairs that Russia continues to support all of the relevant actors and parties in Yemen, and that it is working to unify their position and to improve the relationship between them, because we would like to see a Yemen that is unified as it has been for years. And so you're saying that Russia is trying to sit somewhere in the middle, somewhere on the fence. I think we could say that. Yes, I think that would be accurate. Okay, thank you very much. If we could please move on to our colleague and friend Ahmed Dahshan. Ahmed, I wanted to hear from you your assessment on what was expressed by our colleague Mikhail on the Russian position and the motivations for what Moscow is doing with regards to the ongoing developments in the Red Sea. Thank you very much. Thank you, I would like to thank all of the audience for being here. Regardless of the announced objectives that were announced by the Russians with regards to their role and relationship with all of the actors. But on the other hand, Russia believes that it has interests in the Red Sea and that it has a legacy in Yemen, whether with North Yemen or South Yemen. And it had a presence in the Red Sea, in Somalia, and the Horn of Africa, and that all of this presence and all of this investment collapsed just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that Russia sees an opportunity, and it's a great opportunity to expand its maritime influence, especially with the Russian military base in Tartarus in Syria, Tartus in Syria, and that it is supporting this with the base in Crimea and the Sevastopol base. And so there has been a link between the Black Sea and the base in Syria. And if it is able to secure a base on the Red Sea, it could create a link all the way to the Indian Ocean. And this has been a part of the Russian strategy. It has been an announced Russian strategy and has been for a long time, since the time of the Russian Empire. And so Russia is striving to get a logistical supply point in Sudan, and it believes that the Houthis might be the winning side for them to bet on. The Houthis are in control of the north. They are in full control of the areas under the control, whereas the anti-Houthi camp are viewed by Russia as having closer ties with the West, and that at the end of the day, the interests of the United States and the interests of the West will remain at the forefront. Whereas if it is able to build ties with the Houthis will be more in need of it, and so they will need to have ties with international actors, and Russia can provide this relationship and the diplomatic cover. And this is what we see on the ground, that at the same time Russia aspires to get from the Houthis possibly a military base or military presence, or maybe a logistical supply point in Hodeidah. And if there is a settlement in Yemen, the Houthis will pressure on their end, and the other side will, the anti-Houthi camp will ask for Russia to have a more balanced position. And so Russia believes that in both cases it will be able to make a gain from this. And anything that preoccupies the West and leads to Western military involvement anywhere around the world will definitely be beneficial for Russia, because we need to look at the situation before the 7th of October. Western military focus, whether in intelligence capacities or ammunition, was all focused on Ukraine. But now the United States and Western actors are more involved in what is happening in Gaza, because of the possibility of eruption of a conflict between Israel and Iran, also what is happening in Lebanon, and what is being done by the Houthis. This is all in the interest of Russia, and Russia can also make gains by telling the Western world that we see these claimed principles of being against invasion, of being with human rights, and the double standards that we see in Gaza and other places have become very clear. And so the Russian position, I think, is very justified and rational when it comes to Russian interests. But Ahmed, the Russian stance and the interest that you mentioned, because there are also interests between Russia and the countries of the Gulf. And so this Russian rapprochement with a group like Ansar Allah in Yemen, let me pose the question differently. Will this Russian rapprochement with Houthis have an impact on the good economic ties between Russia and most of the Gulf states, especially the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE? I think that the Russians will market this relationship with the Houthis, and I think they have been doing this to other actors, as being beneficial for the Gulf, meaning that this group, if there is no international recognition for them, and because they do not have any ties with any major powers in the world, that maybe if they do have a relationship with Russia, Russia will be able to better control it or use leverage with it, and that this will be beneficial for the Gulf. And here I'm talking about how Russia is marketing or what is the Russian narrative, that it would be better for Russian fleets to be in the Red Sea rather than Iranian fleets, for example, or Iranian influence, and that they would be better able to leverage the Houthis based on this relationship between Russia and the Houthis. Thank you very much. Hussam, do you agree with what Ahmed said in his analysis on this point specifically, that Russia is marketing this very noticeable rapprochement between them and Ansar Allah as allowing Russia to play a role in leveraging or pressuring, or maybe even we could say controlling Ansar Allah.
تكون هناك نتائج إيجابية
And so that
في
this would
المنطقة،
lead to
منطقة
positive
الخليج.
results for the region
تكون
in the Gulf.
هناك يعني حالة هدوء
That this would
بين
lead to a period
الجماعة وبين
of calm
الدول
and
المناوئة
quiet
لها
between
في
the group
المحيط
in Yemen and
المحيط الخليجي.
neighboring countries.
هل تتفق مع هذه الرؤية؟
Do you agree with this assessment?
هي رؤية دقيقة إلى حد كبير.
Thank you very much. I
أولاً
think to a
خلينا
large extent it is very accurate.
الصوت واضح؟
Can you hear me
الصوت يا
clearly?
أستاذ حسام لا يصل لنا.
I can't hear you, Hassam.
ألو؟
Can you hear me now? Can anyone hear me?
للأسف لا أستطيع أن
Unfortunately,
أسمع.
I cannot
أنا
hear you.
بسمع صوتك.
I can hear Hassam.
طيب
Okay.
حتى يعني يمكن إصلاح الصوت عند الأستاذ
While we
حسام
try to
رضوان.
fix
ما
the
رأيك
audio,
نتوجه بهذا
Hassam's audio, if I
السؤال
could
للأستاذة
please ask this question
ميساء.
to
يعني
Maysa.
حتى اتفقينا مع ما
Do
تفضل
you
به
agree
الزميل
with
أحمد
the
دهشان
assessment by Ahmed
ميساء في هذا
Dahshan
الخصوص. يعني
on
هل
that
تستطيع
topic?
بالفعل روسيا
Do you think
أن
that Russia
تضبط
could
حركة الحوثيين
actually
وإذا كانت
have
بالفعل
leverage over the
تستطيع
Houthi
ذلك؟
movement? And
يعني
if it
هل
can
هي
do that,
راضية
do you
على
think that
إطلاق صواريخ
it
على
is
الملاحة الدولية؟
it is happy or
لا أحد
content
يستطيع
with the
ضبط
attacks?
الموضوع
I don't think
مبدئيا
anyone can
يعني.
control the Houthis. I think that is
أعتقد
a
إنه
very
الصوت
basic
بيشتغل
point.
عندنا كلنا ما عدا عند
I think we can
أستاذ
all
رام.
hear Hussam. I think maybe it's an audio
صوتي
problem on
الآن
your
مسموع
end,
أو
Am.
صوتي الآن مسموع؟
Can you hear me now?
الآن
Now I can hear you.
مسموح يا أستاذ حسام.
Now I can hear you, Hussam.
طيب هل ممكن أخطف الميكروفون من الأستاذة ميساء؟
If I could take the microphone from Maysa, yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
طيب إذا كنا عاوزين نفهم
Thank you. If we want to try to understand more accurately the determinants of the Russian position towards the Yemeni crisis, and this is a conclusion of all of what has been said by my colleagues, I think there are three main determinants for Russian policy towards Yemen. The first is Russia's desire to continue to have a role in Yemen. Specifically, the long-term Russian investment has not been in Moscow becoming a party to the conflict on any side, whether the conflict between the Houthis and the legitimate government, but for it to maintain ties and communication with all sides so that it can play an important role in mediation. And I think Russia has been successful to a large extent in doing that. They have an important voice in the Security Council, which will be an important reference for any political settlement in Yemen. And secondly, I would like to give you an example. In 2023, when the Saudi ambassador wanted to start his visits to Yemen for rapprochement with the Houthis, there was a high-level visit by the ambassador Mohammed Al-Jabir to meet with the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as with the Middle East officer. And it seemed like it was an attempt to get a green light. And this shows that the Russians are still able to have a presence and to play a balanced, like you said, for them to remain on the fence, to play the role of a mediator. The second determinant is more of a regional determinant in Russia's behavior towards the Yemeni crisis, and it is an attempt to balance Russia's interests with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and this has moved from being a purely tactical or transactional relationship into one that is a strategic rapprochement, and so it is no longer a tactical rapprochement, especially with Saudi Arabia's attempts to diversify its international alliances. And this was very clear with the Saudi position towards the Ukrainian crisis. We saw that there was a strategic alignment to a large part between Saudi Arabia and Russia. But on the other hand, there is also Iran. Iran is still committed in its strategic partnership with Russia, especially in opposing or confronting the West. But what is interesting is that the war in Ukraine has strengthened the relationship between Russia with both Iran and Saudi Arabia at the same time. And it has not forced Russia or Moscow to choose sides. And so it takes into account Iran's interests and Saudi Arabia's interests when managing or dealing with the Yemeni crisis. The third determinant is more at the international level, and it is the very clear competition with the United States of America. The link that Ahmed showed about the Russian strategic perspective in the region, or its presence in around the world, I think is very accurate. But it's very clear that it's more involved in competition in the Mediterranean, and this was seen with the visits by President Putin to East Asia, as well as their presence and the with also attempts to have more of a presence or influence in the Red Sea, but Russia is still unable to have long-term and permanent presence to compete with the United States in the southern Red Sea, especially in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And so this competition between Russia and the United States, and there's also the topic of Africa. And so this area, the North Africa and the Sahara, these are the main areas of confrontation between the US and Russia, and not the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb, at least not yet. But I believe that there is an exaggeration in the Russian position towards the Houthis. If the Russians were very serious in having a long-term investment in the Houthis and their attacks, they could have vetoed the Security Council resolution in January, which allowed American forces and other foreign forces to carry out defensive actions in the Red Sea. Thank you. Sorry, but Hussam, sorry to interrupt. This is a very important point. I think it's a very important point that you've mentioned. So you're saying that you're against the exaggeration of the Russian relationship with the Houthis. You think that there's some exaggeration in the how close the ties are. Yes, and the Russians have given this impression themselves, meaning that the Houthis were a complex dilemma for Russia. On one hand, the Houthi attacks gave the legal and moral justification based on the Security Council resolution to militarize the Red Sea in the interests of the Americans. And even at the economic level, on several instances, the Houthi attacks would affect Russian vessels. But sorry, Hussam, on that point, so Russia is not benefiting from the militarization of the Red Sea. Yes, of course. And so the Houthi attacks are a dilemma from on the other hand. But now that these attacks have been carried out, the Russians might use this to as a threat that we will invest in the Houthis to divert attention. But this is still just in the media. These are some leaks, I think, that were in the Wall Street Journal or Newsweek, I believe, which issued two reports that the Russians were thinking about providing missiles to the Houthis. But other than that, I have not seen any material or practical indicator that there is a strategic shift in Russia to invest in the Houthis, because in the long term, I'm sorry to interrupt once again. It was also said that Russia will provide Iran with advanced missile defense systems, as was covered in Western media outlets. Yes, exactly. But I'm talking about supporting a rebel group. If Russia provides Iran with anything, these are two states dealing with each other, and Iran has also provided Russia with drone capacities and others. But I'm saying that Russia, as a sovereign state, for it to decide to have long-term investments in a rebel group that threatens international shipping, this decision will only be made in one case: if Russia believes that the conflict in Ukraine has reached a point of no return, they need to open a new front in the Red Sea. But we still haven't gotten to that point. We see some initial or preliminary indicators. Sorry to interrupt, Hazam, but I wanted to discuss that point specifically. And that was one of the points that Maysa should have spoken about. But the practicality of this from the Russian perspective, I think it's important that we ask this question to Mikhail. Do you agree with this view? Do you agree with what Hussam said, that this the Russian relationship with the Houthis getting or improving, that this might happen or might increase or accelerate if a point of no return was reached for Moscow and Ukraine, meaning that if Moscow feels like the situation on the Ukrainian front is deteriorating, it might use the Houthis as a bargaining chip and provide the Houthis with the weapons and the military capabilities that they need. Do you agree with this point? You're still muted, Mikhail. I'm very sorry for that. I think that the relationship between Russia and the Houthis, Ansar Allah, as
موسكو لا تعلن
remained
جهارا
and Moscow has not announced publicly
تقدم
or openly
السلاح
that it is providing arms
للحوثيين
to the Houthis.
وتحاول أن تبقى يعني
And it tries
موقفها
to continue to have
معتدلة بهذا الخصوص.
a moderate
ولكن
position
لا
with that regards. But I do not, I don't think it impossible, or I don't think it unlikely that at one day in the future it might provide these military capacities, just like the Russian president said that we would provide the United States opponents and the opponents of the NATO countries, which are providing Ukraine with advanced weaponry, and that Russia might do something similar when it comes to the United States opponents and the opponents of the NATO states. We might see the results of these statements very soon if the situation, if the special military operation, if the situation in the special military operation gets worse. But the situation now is developing positively for the Russian army. And so I do not think that Moscow will be able to announce that it is providing the Houthis with advanced weaponry. But I still don't think it is. I don't think it's unlikely that these back channel. I think these back channel negotiations are definitely taking place, but there hasn't been any confirmation of that. We here in Moscow, for example, see that there's something going on. Something has developed. And so it is not unlikely that we hear that the Houthis have more advanced weaponry or receive more advanced weaponry from Iran, for example. And so Moscow is not trying to. Moscow is not giving arms to the Houthis directly, maybe through a third parties or other countries, and that might be more likely to occur.
نعم طيب
Thank you very much.
ميخائيل.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, for that intervention.
طبعا إمكانية للسادة الحاضرين معنا في هذه الجلسة.
There's an opportunity for our audience to ask questions. You can send the question to us in the question and answer box, or can ask to raise your hand to ask a question directly, and we will try to ensure that we discuss or address these questions. I wanted to ask a question to Mesa. Mesa, the Houthis cannot be seen separately from Iran, or we cannot view them as two. And this is what's being called in the Arab world. We could say Iran's allies. Some call them allies, some call them proxies or Iran's tools. And there have always been discussions about Hezbollah in Lebanon. In Lebanon, the Houthis or Ansar Allah in Yemen, and other groups in Iraq as well. And so my question is, to what extent can we say that the Houthis, in their positions, in their stances, and in their actions, are under the control of Tehran in doing this? Can we say that everything that the Houthis do, when it comes to the Red Sea specifically, is being coordinated with Iran? Is there an Iranian green light, for example, for everything that they do in the Red Sea? That's always been the million-dollar question when it comes to the Houthis. There's always been a lot of debate about to what extent are the Houthis independent in their decision-making from Iran. There were discussions at a certain stage when the Red Sea crisis escalated that they tried to get Iran to stop these attacks, but Iran says that it was unable to influence the Houthis' decision-making. No one knows to what extent this is true, but what is confirmed is that there are Iranian experts on the ground, and these are very important experts. Intelligence information is also received by the Houthis from Iran. And so the possibility of the Houthis operating independently from Iran, especially in the Red Sea, I think is unlikely, at least when it comes to the Red Sea. Abdul Malik al-Houthi had usually tried to present himself as a purely Yemeni actor that is independent from Iran. This was during the war between his group and the Saudi coalition. But since the beginning of the Gaza war, Abdul Malik al-Houthi has always presented himself as being part and parcel of the axis of resistance. And there's also been a significant level of coordination between the Houthis and Iraqi groups specifically, or Iraqi factions. Hezbollah also has emotional influence over the Houthis and the decision making. They have influence over Abdul Malik al-Houthi specifically. And I think that Iran gives some space for independence for many of the factions that are affiliated with it. But the Houthis have independence in their economic revenues and resources, but they need Iran militarily and the military support, and even their economic needs or economic need for Iran has increased because of the fuel shipments being given by Iran to the Houthis. And so Iran has invested very little in them, but have gotten a lot in return. And so I think this is a relationship where both sides are benefiting from it and both sides are keen to maintain it. And so the idea that the Houthis would oppose or oppose Iran or work against its interests or its commitments, I think that would be impossible to see or very unlikely. But I think Iran gives the Houthis independence in some of the tactical matters, and I think that is something that the Houthis have a level of independence in. Let us go a bit deeper into the question. Do you think that there might be Houthi, Russian, and Iranian coordination on these operations in the Red Sea? There might be in the future. I don't think anyone knows where things are going, especially when it comes to this escalation between Russia, the West and Russia, and also between the United States and China. It depends on who's going to be the next American administration and whether it's going to be Trump or Harris. We have a number of important elections that are going to decide where things head, the most important of which are the American presidential elections. And so nothing is all of this is likely. And even the main Gulf states, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE primarily, which have important economic ties, they've tried as much as possible to remain neutral. But the possibility of them remaining neutral, or the possibility of them remaining neutral if the crisis continues to escalate between the two sides, I think that'll be difficult to say. And at that point, each actor might need to take a very clear side. But as of now, there hasn't been a comprehensive or broader war in the region, and I think there is still room for neutrality. Like, for example, China, I think will be losing out because of this crisis, because this is affecting the commercial routes from China to the rest of the world, specifically to Europe and to West Africa, or sorry, East Africa and North Africa. But China links what's the war in Gaza and the Red Sea crisis, unlike the West, who are seeing it as an independent or separate development or crisis that has nothing to do with the Gaza war. And so China hasn't asked the Houthis to stop, so the West has asked the Houthis to stop these attacks and are trying to see it as completely being separate from the war in Gaza. And in the future, these attacks might be repeated, even if the Gaza war ends. The Houthis have discovered very important capabilities and a very important point of leverage that they could use. And like I've said before, the Houthis have an appetite to be more of a regional actor. They want to play a larger international regional role, and they don't see themselves as just a local actor in Yemen. And so by the nature of the Houthis or Ansar Allah, I think it would be very easy for them to do that. And if Iran encourages this, I think it was encouraged by Iran, and I think it would be also very easy for Russia or China to encourage it if they need to do so. But I wanted to say is that the Houthis are a group that is very difficult to control. It is an adventurous group that doesn't mind taking risks. And I think their
فبالتالي
rationale in a lot of
إن
their
أنت
actions is that they have
تتعامل
nothing
معاها
to lose.
وتتصور إنك
And
سوف
so for you
تسيطر
to
عليها
deal with it and to
وتتحكم
think that
فيها،
you'll be
هذه
able to control it,
مسألة
I think is
أتصور إنها
an
فيها
incorrect
خطورة.
approach or a very risky
وهذا الذي
approach.
حدث مع كثير من
And that's what
الفصائل
happened with
المحلية
many
اليمنية
of the
في التعامل
local
معها.
actors in dealing with the Houthis.
هل تدرك يا أستاذ ميخائيل، هل تدرك موسكو
Does Moscow
هذه
understand
النقطة
this,
التي
Mikhail? Do they
تشير
understand this
إليها
specific point
الأستاذة
that
ميساء،
Mesa just mentioned?
أنه جماعة الحوثي
That
أو
the
جماعة أنصار
Houthis or
الله
Ansar Allah
صعب السيطرة عليها. أنت
are a group
تقول
that is
بأنه
difficult to control.
روسيا تحاول
You said that
أن
Russia is trying
تقيم
to
علاقات متوازنة مع
build
أطراف
or
الأزمة
have
اليمنية،
equal
وفي
relations
مقدمتها
with all
طبعا
of the actors
جماعة أنصار
in
الله
the Yemeni
الحوثية.
crisis, and
هل
primary
تدرك
or
روسيا،
starting
هل
with the
باستطاعة روسيا
Houthis.
أن
Does
تسيطر
does
على
does can Russia
الحوثي؟
control the Houthis or use leverage against them
نعم.
or with them? I
منذ
think so.
شهر ونصف وصل وفد من الحوثيين
A month
أنصار
and a half
الله إلى
ago, a
موسكو،
delegation from the
والتقى
Houthis from Ansar
معهم
Allah arrived in Moscow, and they met
ميخائيل
with
بogdanov المبعوث
Mikhail
الرئاسي
Bogdanov,
ونائب
the
الوزير
presidential
الخارجية،
envoy and a deputy minister of foreign affairs.
أنا كمان اشتأت معهم،
I also
وهم
met with them,
تحدثوا
and they spoke
عن
about
هويتهم، لأنه بالنسبة
their
لي
identity.
أنا كمان زي ما قالت ميس، أنا
Because just like
اكتشفت
Mesa
هذه
said,
الجماعة
this was
لأنه
something
كان
that we
جديدا.
discovered. We
أنا
discovered this
كنت
group because it was a new group.
اليمن
I
في
was
85
in Yemen in
و86
1985 and 1986,
وهم تحدثوا عن
and the delegation spoke
عقيدتهم
about their ideology, their beliefs,
وتصرفاتهم،
their actions.
أنا فهمت أنهم
And from what I
يحتاج إلى
understood,
مساعدة من
they
قبل القيادة الروسية،
they need
وليس
assistance
فقط
or
في
support from
المجال
the Russian
العسكري
leadership, and not
وفي
just
المجال
military support,
الزراعي الفلاحي
but also in
الاقتصادي
agriculture, also in
الاستثماري.
economic support and investments.
ممكن نقول أنهم مغامرون،
And so I think
ولكن
we all agree that it is an
فيما
adventurous group,
لحظة
but
الصدق لما
I
كانوا
think
هناك
when
إبادة
it comes
جماهيرية
down to it,
فضيحة شاملة أمام العالم كله، هم كانوا القوة الوحيدة اللي
when we saw these very scandalous
نحن
developments
سندافع
that the whole
الشعب
world was watching, they
الفلسطيني.
were the only ones that came out and said that we will defend
يعني
the
في
Palestinian people.
عقيدتهم يعني في
And so in their ideology or in their
جاء
beliefs,
بالرسالة وصمود.
I think there is
أنا كنت
resilience
يعني
and
كنت
bravery. I had
أتوقع
expected
مثل هذا الرد من
this
بعض
kind of
البلدان
response
العربية،
from
ولكن
some Arab states,
مع الأسف لا.
but unfortunately we did not see
وأحب
this response at all.
أن أقول أن أذكر أنه
And I also
عفوا
wanted to
عفوا
mention that
يا أستاذ
yesterday,
ميخائيل، عفوا
I'm
على
sorry, Mikhail,
المقاطعة.
sorry to
يعني
interrupting
البعض
you.
يقول بأنه كل ما تقوم به جماعة
We're
أنصار
saying that
الله
everything that
هي
Ansar Allah are doing
مجرد يعني حركات استعراضية،
are
يعني
just an attempt
لا
by them to
لا تسمن
flex
من
their
جوع
regional power, and that
كما
it is
يقال.
not really effective
يعني هي
at
مجرد
helping the
شو
causes that they claim to help.
عسكري،
That this is just a military
ليس
show,
لها نتيجة
and that it
مؤثرة
does not
على أرض
have
الواقع،
any
هكذا
real
يقول البعض. ما
influence or
رأيك؟
impact on the ground. That is what some have said. And so, what is
هذا
your opinion on
البعض
that? I think
زي ما
that,
قلت
yes,
أنا
some believe that.
من
Just like
أولئك
myself,
الذين إلى
I was
اليوم
one of the
يعرفون
people who
شيئا
did not
عنهم،
know anything about the
بمجرد يعني
group.
الحصول على المعلومات عن هويتهم
And as soon as I
ممكن
got more
أن
information on their identity and their beliefs,
نقول أنه هم مش يعني مغامرين ومش
I think we could say that
زي ما فكرنا
you might.
سابقا، لأنه
I think we can say that they're not
لديهم
what we
عقيدة،
thought before. I think
لديهم
they have
يعني
a very clear
تصرفات،
creed,
لديهم
and they
موقف
have a very clear
مبدئي وثابت.
position, one that is a principled position that has remained constant.
ذكرت أنه أمس سيرجي
I
لافروف
mentioned that yesterday
كانت بعض
Sergei
المباحثات مع
Lavrov
الوزير
had discussions with
اليمني،
the
قال ذكر
Yemeni Minister of
أنهم
Foreign Affairs, and he mentioned that
يدعمون الاتصالات العسكرية
they support the
مع الطرف
military
اليمني.
telecommunications with
وزي ما
the
فهمت هذا
Yemeni
يعني
side.
كان
And as I
يعني
understood,
تشمل ليس فقط
this included
يعني الجيش الحكومي،
This
بل
included not just
العساكر
the Yemeni
الحوثيين.
military or armed forces, but
ولذلك
also the armed
الهدف
forces of the
دبلوماسية
Houthis. But
روسية
diplomatically, the
هي
objective
تقريب
of Russian
المواقف
diplomacy is to try to reach a
يعني
rapprochement, to
تقريب
reach a convergence of
الحوثيين
views
والحكومة
between the
اليمنية
Houthis and the
حتى
Yemeni
تكون
government,
بلد
so that the
موحد.
country could remain
وبعدين
unified.
ممكن أن نرى قدوم روسيا
And
الاتحادية
then we might
إلى هذه
see
المنطقة بما كان عليه
the Russian
عقب
Federation
الاتحاد السوفيتي، لأنه
being more involved in the
روسيا
region as
اكتشفت
it
الآن
was during the
أهمية
time of the
هذه
Soviet Union, because
الجزء
I think Russia
من
discovered the geopolitical importance
فلذلك لا
of this
أستبعد
area, and so I
هذا
don't think
القدوم،
it
ولكن
unlikely
لابد من
that
تدبير
there would
الأوضاع
be
في
more
اليمن.
more involvement by Russia. But first,
نعم.
the
طيب
situation in Yemen must be
أعود من
stabilized.
جديد إلى زميل أحمد
Thank you
دهشان.
very
أستاذ
much.
أحمد،
We'll go back to
يعني
Ahmed
دعنا
Dahshan. Ahmed,
نقترب أكثر
let
من
us get a bit closer
علاقة
to or
روسيا
discuss the relationship between Russia
بدول ما يعرف بمحور المقاومة،
and the actors
يعني
in or the states
إيران
involved in the
تحديدا،
axis
يعني
of resistance,
إلى
Iran
أي درجة
specifically. So
يمكن
to what
أن
extent
تدعم روسيا
can Russia
إيران
support Iran
وحليفات إيران
and
في
Iran's
المنطقة،
allies
الجماعات التي
in the region,
نتحدث عنها، سواء كانت جماعة أنصار
and
الله أو جماعة
whether they are Ansar
حزب
Allah
الله؟
or Hezbollah?
هل إلى أي مدى يمكن أن تقف روسيا
To what
في
extent can Russia support
هذه مع هذه الجماعات؟ يعني الأستاذ
these
حسام قبل
groups?
قليل قال
Hussam
بأنه إذا
not long
ما
ago
وصلت
said that
الأمور إلى
if
نقطة
the
اللاعب
situation
في
reaches a point of no
أوكرانيا
return in
بالنسبة
Ukraine
لموسكو،
for Moscow, then
فموسكو ستكون يعني حرة طليقة اليدين في فعل
Moscow
ما يمكن أن تفعله
will
وما
consider other
تستطيع أن
options
تفعله.
and see
ويمكن
what it can do.
الأستاذ ميخائيل أشار الآن
And
إلى
maybe Mikhail
تصريحات
also
الرئيس
mentioned this.
الروسي
He
فلاديمير
mentioned
بوتين في وقت
the
سابق،
statements that were
عندما
made by the Russian
يعني أشار
President
إلى
Vladimir
إمكانية
Putin in the
وضع
past when he
أسلحة،
mentioned the
ربما تكون
possibility of
أسلحة غير
providing
تقليدية
uh,
كما يقول البعض،
military
يعني
capabilities.
في
They might be
دول
non-traditional military capabilities
في خصومة مع الغرب. هل
to
يمكن
states
أن
that
تقدم
are
روسيا
opposed to
مثلا
the West?
حكاية في الغرب
And so could Russia do
على
this in order
خطوات
to
غير
do
تقليدية
as
في
a part of the
علاقاتها
conflict with the West?
مع
Could they take
دول ما يعرف
non-traditional
بمحور
steps
المقاومة؟
with the actors involved in the axis of resistance? Do you think this
هو
is
بالنسبة
likely?
لي ما يسمى محور المقاومة
Thank you
هو
very much. With regards to
الدولة
what
الرئيسية
is
فيه هي
called
إيران.
the axis of resistance, the
يمكن ضم
main
سوريا،
actor, the
وسوريا
main
طبعا في
state
وضع
is
كما هو معلوم
Iran.
من
We could
الذهنيات
also add
العالم
Syria, but I
والفوضى
think as we all
وعدة
know,
قوى
Syria is
مسيطرة
in a
عليها،
state of
لكن لا
chaos,
أعتقد
and there are a number of
أن
actors who are
روسيا
involved with it.
يمكن أن
But I
تمنح
don't think
أسلحة
that
نووية
Russia
أو ذات
will
قيمة
provide
استراتيجية
qualitative
لأي
or
جماعة
strategically
مسلحة
valuable
سواء للحوثيين أو
weapons to
حتى
any
لحزب
armed group,
الله،
whether the
بدليل
Houthis or
بالذكر
even
أن كل
Hezbollah.
الأسلحة اللي
And I should
يمكن
mention that all of
تصنيفها
the
أسلحة
arms
ذات
that
قيمة
could be
استراتيجية
provided,
على غرار مضادات الدروع الكورنت اللي كانت لدى
other
حزب
than
الله
the
وتم
Cornet
استخدامها في حرب 2006، هي كانت
anti
قادمة
personnel
إلى
missiles
الحزب إما
that
عن
came
طريق
to
النظام
Hezbollah
السوري
were either
أو
provided through the Syrian
الإيرانيين،
regime or through
لكن
the
لم تتعامل
Iranians.
روسيا بشكل
But
مباشر مع
Russia
أي
has
طرف من
not
هذه
directly
الجماعات.
dealt with
بالتأكيد
any
هي
of these
تعلم عندما
actors.
تمنح
I think
إيران
definitely
بعض
Russia
الأسلحة
knows
أن
that
إيران
when
سترسل
it
بعضها
gives
إلى
Iran some of
بعض
these
هذه
arms,
الجماعات،
that Iran
لكن
will
هي
be
لا
providing
تتورط في
them to
التعامل
some of the
المباشر.
actors in the axis of
أيضا لن
resistance. But I
تتورط
think
في
Russia is
اعتماد
not
ولماذا لا
involved in providing
تتورط أستاذ
directly.
أحمد
Why
التعامل
not? Why
المباشر؟
doesn't
يعني
it deal
ما الذي
directly with these
تخشى؟
actors?
ما
What
الذي
is Russia
يوقفها؟ هي
concerned about, or
تستقبل
what is stopping it
جماعة
from
أنصار
doing
الله
so?
في موسكو كما استقبلت
It is hosted
وتستقبل
delegation by
قادة
Ansar Allah in
حركة حماس
Moscow,
في
as
موسكو،
welcomed visits by
وتفرش
leadership
لهم
from
السجاد
Hamas.
الأحمر في
And I think they've
الخارجية
laid down the red
وتقديم
carpet
كبار
for them
المسؤولين
in
في
doing these
الخارجية. ما
meetings, and
الذي
they meet with
يعني ما
high-level
الذي
officials in the
يمكن
Russian
أن
Ministry
يمنع
of Foreign
موسكو
Affairs.
في ذلك؟
And so what might stop Moscow from dealing
أن
directly with these actors?
تستقبلهم وتتحدث بأنها بتفتح حوار
Welcoming
سياسي
them
بتدعو
and opening up
للتسوية
a channel for
لأن يصل
political
الأمر
and
إلى منح
diplomatic
الأسلحة
communication
لهذه
is one
الجماعات
thing,
فهو
but
أمر آخر. أولا
granting
روسيا
arms to
بتخشى
these groups, I think, is a
إنه
different matter,
فتح
because
المجال
Russia fears
لتسليح
that opening
جماعات
up
خارج نطاق
opening
الدولة
up the channel for
واعتبارها جماعات
arming
مناهضة
non-state
لطرف ما
actors
أو معارضة لطرف ما ولها شرعية، سيفتح المجال
will
أيضا في
open
المقابل لجهات
will open the
غربية
door
لفعل
for
الشيء
the
نفسه
West
مع
doing the
جماعات
same
قد
thing
تكون مناهضة لروسيا أو
with
حلفاء روسيا في المستقبل القريب
anti-Russian or
في
anti-Russian
البلدان
ally
الخليجية،
groups
وهذا أمر
ولكن يعني عفوا
within
معلش
the
على
former
المقاطعة
Soviet
أنا
Union.
آسف،
I'm sorry to
ولكن
interrupt you
يعني
once again,
الغرب
Ahmed,
يمد
but the
أوكرانيا
West is
الآن
already providing
بأنواع
Ukraine
مختلفة من
with
الأسلحة
different kinds
المتطورة،
of armaments, of very
وربما
advanced
كان
weapons as
ذلك
well.
يعني يعد خطا أحمر في وقت
And I think
سابق
this might have been
بالنسبة
seen as a red line in the
لروسيا،
past for
لكن
Russia,
الغرب
but the
تجاوز هذا
West
الخط الأحمر.
has
لماذا
crossed this
تلتزم
red line.
موسكو
So why would
بخطوطها
Moscow
الحمر
adhere to its
ولا
own red
يلتزم
lines,
الغرب بهذه
whereas the West
الخطوط؟
is not adhering to these same
هذا هو
red
الأمر.
lines? I think that's
أوكرانيا
the
دولة.
issue.
حتى
Ukraine at
الغرب
the end of the day is the
بيدعي إنه
state
أنا
that
بمنح أوكرانيا
even the
كدولة وإنها
West
دولة بتحاول
claims that
دفاعها عن
is
النفس
it is a sovereign
وتعرضت
state and
للاحتلال من قبل
that it
روسيا.
was invaded by
لكن
Russia, and so
ولكن
we are
عفوا
giving them
برضه يعني
advanced
عفوا
weapons. But
يعني
sorry to
الصراع
interrupt
الذي
once
يقوده
again.
روسيا على
The
حسب ما
conflict
يقول الرئيس
between
الروسي
Russia, based
ووزير
on
خارجية
the
لافروف، هو
statements of
صراع
the
وجودي.
Minister of Foreign
يعني
Affairs
بمعنى
and
انه
the
هذا الصراع الذي
Russian president, that this is
يستمر
an
من العام الثالث
existential
على
crisis.
التوالي
This conflict, which
ربما
is in its third
يعني
year,
يتوقف على نتيجته مستقبل روسيا ومستقبل الروس
the
نفسهم يعني
the
فلماذا
future
تتجه
of
موسكو
Russia might depend on it.
بالقواعد
And so,
المتعارف
why is
عليها؟
Russia adhering to these
يعني
agreed
قد يكون
upon red
يعني
lines in that
انسدابك
case?
لموسكو أفضل
I think the answer
كليملين
would be
نفسه
better
يتحدث، لكن وفق ما لدينا يعني
to get
من
that answer from
معطيات
Moscow. But based
وسط
on
التجارب
what we see,
السابقة
based on
موسكو
our
لم
analysis
تتورط
and
في منح
previous
هذه
experiences,
الجماعات أسلحة.
Russia
موسكو ما
has
بعد
not given
الاتحاد
these
السوفيتي طبعا
groups
أتحدث
arms. And this is after
لديها
the Soviet
محددات
Union.
بتخشى من
Russia has
خلالها
very
انه هذا
clear,
الامر
I
سيفتح
think, that
المجال
red lines that it believes
لمنح
this will
جماعات
open
اخرى
the
مناوئه
door
لها اسلحه يمكن ان
for its own
تتساهل او
opponents or groups that are
تتسامح في
opposed to it
ارسال
being
هذه الاسلحه
given
عن طريق
arms.
الطرف الايراني
It might
وتتحجج
send these
بانه انا
arms
لم
through
ارسل مثلا
Iran,
على
for
سبيل المثال
example, or
لحزب
say
الله او
that I did
لحماس
not
اسلحه
provide these
بل
arms
لدوله
directly
الدوله
to
الايرانيه،
Hezbollah or
والدوله الايرانيه
to
قررت ان تمنح بعض
Hamas.
من هذه
We
الأسلحة.
worked with the Iran
لكن
state, and Iran state
الجزء او السؤال
decided
اللي حضرتك
to
تفضلت به
transfer
هو
these
وارد
arms to
الحدوث،
other actors.
لا
But I think
يمكن
the
اعتباره
possibility
امر
of what you said
مستبعد. حال
is
تغيرت
not
الأوضاع
impossible
ووصلت
if the
العلاقة
situation
الروسية أو
changes
الغربية،
and
يعني
the
أنا عايز
relationship between Russia
أفرق
and
ما
the
بين
West reaches a
تلويح
point.
روسيا للغرب
There's a difference between
بأن
a
ما
Russian
يحدث في
threat
أوكرانيا
saying
يمكن
that
أن
what's happening in
يؤدي إلى
Ukraine
رد روسي يخلق
might
مشاكل للغرب،
lead to a
وما بين
Western response that
قرار
causes
روسي
problems
بالفعل
for
هذا
the
الأمر
West, and a
بشكل
decision
محدد
by Russia
باستقرار.
to actually do
حتى
this in a
الآن
very
لا يبدو أن
clear
روسيا لديها قرار
manner.
أو اتخذت هذا القرار.
I don't think
هل
Russia has
يمكن
made
أن
their decision
تتخذه
yet.
حال وجدت
Might it
أنه
take it?
العلاقة
Yes,
مع الغرب وصلت إلى
if it
طريق
sees that
العودة؟
its
أعتقد بعد
relationship
الانتخابات
with
الأمريكية
the West has
ومعرفة
reached a
من
point of no
الذي
return.
ينمي
I think
الرئيس
after the
الجديد قاله
American administration,
يمكن
whatever the new
أن نقيم
administration
بشكل أكثر
decides,
دقة
it'll
الموقف
be
الروسي من
easier
هذا
for us to
الأمر.
better
لكن لا
understand the
أعتقد
Russian
قبل هذا
position on this
يمكن
matter.
أن
But I
تمنح
don't
روسيا
think
سلاح
that anytime before
نوعي
that Russia will
ذو قيمة
provide any
استراتيجية للحوثيين
qualitative
أو
or
لغيرهم.
strategic arms to the Houthis or to any other
في هذه النقطة يعني
non-state
كي
actor.
نغلق
On that point
الباب يعني
specifically,
هل
just so we
يمكن أن
could end
تصل
our discussion of the
يعني
topic,
دعم أو يصل دعم روسيا
could Russia's support
لحركات مقاومة
to resistance groups
يعني نكاية في الغرب تصل لمرحلة أو لنقطة التضحية بالعلاقات
can it reach a
الروسية
point where
الخليجية
Russian
أو حتى
Gulf
العلاقات
ties
مع
are
إسرائيل
sacrificed for that, or
يعني
even the
أنا
ties
بالأمس
with
كنت أجري
Israel?
حوارا
Yesterday, I
مع
was
السيد
I was in a dialogue with Mr.
كاراغانوف سيرجي كاراغانوف
Karagov,
يعني البوليتولوج المحلل السياسي المعروف
who is a
والمفكر
well-known
السياسي المعروف
political analyst.
ويعني أشار في
And he
هذه
mentioned
النقطة إلى أنه
during that discussion that
إسرائيل على
Israel,
سبيل المثال
for example,
لم تقف بشكل واضح وصريح
has not
لصالح
taken a very
أو
clear
في صف
position
أوكرانيا ضد روسيا
with
وبالتالي هناك علاقات هناك
Ukraine
مليون
against Russia.
ونصف المليون على الأقل
Even though there
روسي
are
أو
1 or
يهودي من أصول
1.5
روسية
million
في إسرائيل يعني فلماذا
Israelis of Russian
تضحي
origin, and so
روسيا
why would
بهذا
Russia sacrifice
بهذا دعنا نقول رأس المال المعنوي
that capital
في
or this
إسرائيل
asset that it has in
لا
Israel?
أعتقد أنه يعني إسرائيل روسيا
I do
قادرة
not
على
think
أن
that
تتخذ هذه
Russia
الخطوة.
can
لا
take that
ينبغي أن
step,
ننسى أن
but
إسرائيل
we
تعرضت
must not
لضغوط
forget that
عديدة من
Israel was
الولايات
under a
المتحدة
lot of
الأمريكية
pressure
ومن
by the
أوكرانيا ومن
United States
زيلينسكي،
and by
ومن خاطب
Ukraine and by
الإسرائيليين حتى
Zelensky, who
بصفته
spoke
يهوديا
directly
وبأنني
to
يهودي
Israelis
مثلكم
as a
لأجل
person,
الحصول
as a
على
Jew, saying that I'm a Jew
أنظمة
like you,
دفاع جوي
so that they could
أو
get
على طائرات
the
بدون
air
طيار أو بعض
defense
الصواريخ.
systems as well as
والطرف
some
الإسرائيلي
drones
لم
and
يرسل أي
missiles,
شيء
and the
للطرف
Israelis did not
الأوكراني.
provide anything
حكومة
to Ukraine.
نتنياهو تحديدا
The Netanyahu government
التزمت
specifically
تقريبا
has,
حالة من
I
الحياد،
think,
وهذا الحياد قد يكون
maintained its
حياد إيجابي
neutrality.
بالنسبة لروسيا. ربما حكومة نفتالي بنت كانت
And
أكثر
maybe the Naftali
يعني
Bennett
قربا من
government
الغرب.
was closer to the West
سمح
on these
بالمناسبة في
matters.
قلب تل أبيب بخروج تظاهرات
But there were
لمواطنين إسرائيليين
they
يحملوا
allowed
الجنسية
protests in
الروسية
Tel Aviv
داعمين للعملية العسكرية
of
الخاصة في أوكرانيا
Israelis who
ومؤيدين
are
بالرئيس
Russian
بوتين،
in
ويروا
origin in
أن ما
support of the
يحدث في
special
أوكرانيا
military
حرب ضد
operation in
النازيين
Ukraine, in
الجدد.
support of their
فربما
and
الموقف
their support of
الروسي كان يطمح من
President Putin.
إسرائيل
I
فيما هو
think that
أكثر من ذلك
Russia
في
had wanted
تفهم
more than this
دوافع
in
العملية العسكرية
from
الخاصة،
Israel,
خصوصا أن
and
أوكرانيا
understanding the
والقوميين
motivations for
الأوكرانيين
the
وفق
special military
السردية
operation, especially especially since Ukraine and Ukrainian nationalists committed grave violations or violations against the Jewish population. But this has not reached the point of a direct challenge that would allow Israel to give arms to Ukraine. Thank you very much, Ahmed. Hussam, I think there is a very complex network of relationships in the Red Sea. The relationship between the Houthis and the Al-Shabaab movement, for example, in Somalia comes to mind. Could you please explain to us the nature of these relationships, what its future will look like, and what impact it will have on the security in the Red Sea? Thank you very much. Before answering that question in depth, I think that our entry point, we should go back to your earlier question about what is the relationship between Iran and the Houthis specifically. I think that this question has been answered decisively during this year and the end of last year, that this relationship has become a very close relationship, and that the Houthis have proven that they are committed to the agenda of the axis of resistance, whether during war or in peace. And proof of this is that the Iranian-Saudi rapprochement had a direct effect on the Yemeni crisis, and the Houthis decided to accept the roadmap. And also during times of war, through Al-Aqsa flood and the Houthis becoming directly involved in the confrontation, despite the fact that they had very important economic gains that they could have made if they had continued. But they decided to remain committed to the agenda of the axis of resistance. But the important question here is how the Houthis have redefined themselves within the axis of resistance and within the... What has happened since the 7th of October has redefined the Houthis as an actor within the axis of resistance, and has also granted them a larger role up to the level of Hezbollah. It has also redefined the Yemeni front from the Iranian strategic perspective. The Red Sea front and the Yemeni front has proven to Tehran to be the least costly and more beneficial and effective, as well as the more difficult for the West and Washington to deal with. When Tehran, through its allies, decided to escalate in Iraq and Syria, they paid a very high cost, unlike what happened in Yemen. And so in this context, it seems like we are seeing a restructuring of the axis of resistance itself, that we have two important levers within it. The first is the horizontal relationship, which brings together Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza, with its center being in Beirut and Hezbollah. And there's a new axis that is the vertical axis, or the vertical relationship or layer within the axis of resistance, and this goes from Iraq to Yemen and to Somalia. And so in that context, the Houthis have taken two very important steps. The first was to form a joint command center between Iraq and Yemen, and through this they coordinated the actions of the Iran-affiliated militias, including the Popular Mobilization units, carrying out joint operations with the Houthis. And these operations were led by the Houthis. And we have a colleague in the Sana Center who wrote a very detailed study about this, saying that the main command center for the coordination between Iraq and Yemen is in Sana'a. At the same time, the Houthis have started to build important ties on the other side of the Red Sea, or Bab el-Mandeb Strait, specifically the Shabab. I think this is a relationship of tactical relationship, one of coordination, and has not reached a point of strategically including a Shabab in the axis of resistance. But there are discussions that are ongoing. Can the Shabab movement be a new Sunni actor like Hamas involved within the axis of resistance? And in that case, Iran will have been able to expand its influence all the way to the Indian Ocean through its influence in Somalia. But during these discussions between the Houthis and the Shabab movement, there's also a transactional relationship, or a more practical relationship, and the exchange of arms, of finances. And the Houthis have also
حركة الشباب
provided
ببعض
the
الخبرات
Shabab
التي
movement
مكنتهم من
with
القيام بعمليات
expertise that
قرصنة
has allowed
متأخرة
them to carry
في
out more
ال في ال
effective
في ال
piracy
في منطقة
operations
باب المندب
in the Bab
خلال
el-Mandeb Strait
بداية العام الراهن.
during
وحتى
the beginning
الآن
of this year.
العلاقة تسير بنسق
Until now,
تعاون
the relationship has
ولكنه
been
بطيء
one
للغاية
of has been
ومع الوقت
progressing
ومع
through the
استمرار هذا
cooperation, but it is
الاستعار
still very slow to
وهذا
progress.
القتال
And with
المحتدم
the
في غزة
continued
نستطيع أن
fighting
نقول
in Gaza, I think we can say that
بأن الظروف الإقليمية تنضج
I
أكثر
think we can
بالتعاون
say
ما بين
that
الجهادية السنية مثل
the
الكردي
regional
والقاعدة وكذلك
circumstances
حركة
are
الشباب.
increasing ties with other Sunni groups in the region, like Al-Qaeda or
أشكرك
the
أستاذ
Shabab
حسام على
movement. Thank you
هذا
very much,
الشرح
Hussam,
الوافي.
for this
لكن
in-depth explanation
دعونا
of the
إذا
relationship.
كانت هناك
If ever,
إمكانية لاستقبال ربما
if we can take some
بعض الأسئلة إذا كان
questions from the
هناك
participants, I don't know if there are
أسئلة
any
ترسل
questions
إلينا
in the
مكتوبة
Q&A
ربما
box.
لكن إلى ذلك
I
الحين
don't see any
إلى
questions,
ذلك
and so
الحين
until we get some questions,
دعوني أنتقل للأستاذ ميخائيل
let's
مجددا
go
ريثما
back
يعني
to Mikhail.
تصلنا الأسئلة أو حتى أتمكن أنا من فتح هذه الأسئلة. أستاذ ميخائيل، طيب ما هو الحل من
Mikhail,
وجهة نظرك
what do you think is the
في
solution
هذه المنطقة الحساسة
in
بالنسبة
this very sensitive
للجميع،
region,
بالنسبة
one that is
لروسيا،
important for
بالنسبة
all of the actors involved,
للمنطقة
whether
العربية،
Russia,
بالنسبة
whether the
للتجارة
Arab
العالمية.
world, or
ما
international
هو
commerce and
الحل
shipping?
الأمثل من
What do
وجهة
you believe is the optimal or
نظرك
ideal solution
أو من وجهة نظر الروسية؟
from your perspective
من
or
وجهة
from the
نظر
Russian perspective?
الروسية لا أستطيع أن أقول
From the Russian perspective,
بكل
I
جدية.
cannot really say,
بالنسبة لي
but for
كمؤرخ
myself
أنا أرى أن
personally,
المشكلة
I think that the
الوحيدة
only problem
وجود دولة إسرائيل في الشرق الأوسط، وما
is
دام
the
هذه
presence of
الدولة
Israel in the Middle
قائمة
East. As long as this state
فهناك
continues,
ستكون مشاكل بالنسبة
there will
للعرب
always be problems for the
والإقليم
Arab world, for
والبلدان
the region,
المحيطة هذه المنطقة
and for the surrounding
مستمرة،
countries. These
لأنه
problems will only continue
الإنجليز جعل
because the British
غرس هذه الدولة في ربوع
planted the state
الشرق الأوسط
in the middle of the Middle East
كقنبلة مؤقتة
as a time bomb.
وفي ظل يعني استمرار سياسة إسرائيل
And if
العنصرية تجاه
Israel's
البلدان
hostile
العربية
policies continue
لا
towards
تنتظر
the Arab states
تطبيع العلاقات معها ومع البلدان العربية،
and not
ولا
working towards normalization,
لا تتوقع أن تكون الشرق الأوسط
and
خالي من
in that
الحروب.
case, I don't think that the conflicts in the Middle East will end.
أنا عندي سؤال لو أمكن
I had a question, if you'll allow me.
إلى الجانب الروسي يعني
I had a
نغطي.
question to Mikhail.
تفضل يا أستاذ
Go ahead, Hassan.
حسام.
يعني هل ثمة تصور ما
Is there a specific perspective or vision that Russia has
لكيفية حل الأزمات
on how
المشتعلة؟
these ongoing crises can be resolved? And I'm speaking here as a Yemeni. Does Russian diplomacy have an idea of how to resolve the Yemeni crisis
موضوع الصراع العربي الإسرائيلي، لأن هذا الموضوع
outside of the Arab-Israeli conflict? Because I think that seems it will not be resolved anytime soon. Does Russian diplomacy have an idea of what a political solution might look like in Yemen, and has it been able to develop this, especially since it's an actor that has relations with all of the different actors within the conflict, like the SDC, for example, which has secessionist objectives and has an excellent relationship with Moscow. Also, Tariq Saleh's forces on the west coast, which has excellent relations with Moscow, and the Houthis. Have the Russians been able to develop a vision for what that settlement in Yemen might look like? I think that Moscow is relying on finding a diplomatic and political solution when it comes to the Yemeni crisis.
لأنه لما كنت
When I was
في القطر الجنوبي من اليمن
when I was living in southern Yemen in 1985 and 1986, there were two halves of Yemen, the north and the south. And we felt that there was a possibility of unifying the two countries, but there were differing or conflicting ideologies on both sides. I was a student at Moscow University, and there was a graduation of a number of military personnel, and this group was divided into two. The first group was from North Yemen, and the second group was from South Yemen. North Yemen was a capitalist country, whereas the South Yemen was the socialist Yemen, with the Yemen Socialist Party in Yemen being in control.
لتدريب العساكرة أكثر في القطر الشمالي لأنه الاتحاد السوفيتي كانت
The Soviet Union at the time was also obviously a communist state and had communist ideology, but we viewed Yemen as two Yemens. But now the situation has completely changed, and we would like to see Yemen remaining unified, but what is the difference? We need to understand this difference ourselves. Is the division of the country after? Is this a sectarian divide, or is this an ideological divide, or are there other ideologies as well? When Yemen at the time was under the Ottoman and British control, and we need to understand the root causes of this divide. But I believe that Yemen must remain unified, just like just as is the case with Germany or Korea.
GDR يعني ألمانيا شرقية لألمانيا غربية لأنه نحن مختلفين اختلافا كبيرا
we have
تكون هناك توحيد.
I remember I was talking to a German colleague, and they viewed themselves as being very different, and that unity was very difficult. But over time, that became easier. I don't know how Yemenis view this now, but Moscow believes that Yemen's strength lies in its unity. Thank you very much for the answer to that question. We have a question from Yasmin Al-Iryani in the Q&A box, and Yasmin is asking, are there fears that other groups like Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab will become involved in the Red Sea strikes, especially since, if it is correct, that these actors are receiving arms from the Houthis and possibly from Iran? That's the first part of that question. Who would like to answer this question? Are there fears that groups like Al-Qaeda or the Al-Shabaab will be directly involved? I think Hussam has mentioned some of the communication between, or the ties between the Al-Shabaab and the Houthis. But could these ties and this coordination reach the point where they are directly involved? Can I answer that question? Yes, go ahead, Hussam. What's interesting is that Al-Qaeda in Yemen had started to prepare to carry out operations in Yemeni waters, not in the Red Sea, but in the Arabian Sea, in Al-Mahra and Hadramaut governorates. But the Houthis themselves were the ones that pressured it to not carry out these operations. I think the audience here knows the nature of the relationship between the Houthis and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And Al-Qaeda carrying out these operations in Yemeni territorial waters was an important point of dispute with the Houthis for a simple reason, because the Houthis did not want anyone else to take away the limelight in its support for Palestine. The second reason is that the Houthis fear that if Al-Qaeda gets involved in these operations, if Al-Qaeda gets involved in these operations, this will mean that and so the position of Iran and the Houthis was different on this. Like Maysan said, the Houthi stages of escalation were in 4 stages. The 4th stage, which was announced by the Houthis, was that they would expand the scope of their operations to the Indian Ocean, but they failed in doing so for several reasons, the most important of which is that the technical challenges or obstacles that they face. And so the best solution would have been to align or create an alliance with the Shabab and to turn South Sudan into an advanced platform to expand their operations to the widest possible scope towards the Indian Ocean. And so on that basis, they try to provide incentives to the Shabab movement. But something that we need to notice in the formation of the Shabab movement in Somalia, this is a group that tries as much as possible to balance between its jihadist tendencies and its own local priorities as a rebel group that wants to gain power. And so if we survey the operations carried out by Shabab, we'll find that they did not go out of the scope of Somali territorial waters, with the exception of its neighbors, and so it did not go into international waters. They carried out attacks in Ethiopia and Kenya and Djibouti. And this is due to the fact that these countries supported the military operations against the Shabab movement. And so the aspirations of Shabab to play a transnational or international role is not the same tendency, or is not the same aspiration that Al-Qaeda, for example, would have. And this is the reason that Shabab seem to be assessing the various offers provided to it, whether by the Houthis or the IGRC. Thank you very much, Hussam, for that answer. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes remaining in our session, and so if your answers could be as brief as possible. And in that case, in the case that with these groups that we've spoken about being involved, like Shabab or Al-Qaeda, what is Russia's position towards this? I don't know if Mikhail can still hear us. I don't think he can hear me. Ahmed, can you hear me? Oh, Mikhail is back. What is Russia's position or stance on this if groups like Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda carry out attacks in the Red Sea? I think that Russia's stance would be Russia would be against or opposed to this and would not accept these kinds of actions. Okay, another question for you. A question to Mikhail from Mr. Fari' al-Muslimi. He asks, did Russia agree to the Houthis' request during the recent visit to Moscow to buy Russian weapons? And so Russia selling Russian arms to the Houthis. There were no statements on the matter because these negotiations and discussions were back-channel talk. We might imagine that there were discussions to buy Russian arms. And I think during this, I don't think that during this visit. Maybe there were after what was implied in a statement by the Russian president about providing advanced arms to the opponents of the United States. I think then the Ministry of Defense might think about doing something like this. Another part of the question by Farah, I think we mentioned it. What is the status of the Russian consulate in Sana'a today? Is it still closed, or has it remained closed after Saleh's death, or are there still Russian diplomats in Sana'a? Are there Russian diplomats in Sana'a? Yes, there is an embassy that is operational. It is led by an acting ambassador. And I think that very soon there is going to be a Russian chargé d'affaires will be appointed. Why are they not based in the interim capital, Aden? As you've noticed, at the time of the Soviet Union, there was an embassy. The Soviet embassy was in Aden, and then this became a consulate, a general consulate in Aden. And the building for this consulate was almost completely destroyed during the fighting in the city. And so we would need to resolve this. I don't think that's a significant problem, Mikhail. There are many other. I'm sure there are many other buildings that can become a Russian consulate or embassy. At the beginning, we weren't able to find this because it's surrounded by other buildings. But the problem at the time was that this very beautiful building, where I myself worked, has become almost completely destroyed. And hopefully, we will be able to rebuild it. But there would need to be a normalization of the situation in this beloved country. And so is it an issue just with the building, or is it in transportation, for example, to reach Aden from Sana'a, or what exactly is it? The problem is in the situation. The situation is very difficult. And the situation that Yemen is going through overall. I still have hope that hopefully very soon there will be peace in Yemen, and there will be a peaceful settlement, a political settlement. And that is what we all hope. We hope that security and stability and peace returns not just to Yemen, but to all of the areas where there are conflicts leading to the death and destruction of innocents everywhere. The time for our session has ended. I hope that our audience benefited from this discussion and from the session that we had on the Red Sea crisis and Russia's position on it, and the ongoing military developments in the Red Sea. We've mentioned several aspects or dimensions of this crisis and the Russian role. And we hope that in a future session, we will also be able to look into or look more in depth into these aspects, not just with regards to the Red Sea crisis, but also other related topics. This session, which was organized by the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies in cooperation with the Center for Eurasian Studies, or Arab-Eurasian Studies. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for following the broadcast on the various social media platforms, here on Zoom, on X, Facebook, and YouTube. I would also like to thank our dear panelists for participating in the session and for sharing their time. Thank you, Maysa Shuja'ad-Din, Senior Researcher at Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, Mikhail Yushev, a former Russian diplomat and expert on Eurasian affairs. He's someone who's very close to the Arabic language and has spent some of his professional career in Yemen. And I hope that he can return to Yemen and to see Yemen as Felix Arabia or Happy Arabia. And yes, I do hope. I hope that I can return return to those days, not just Yemen. I'd also like to thank Hussam Radman, a researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. I would also like to thank my colleague and friend Ahmed Dahshan, the editor-in-chief at the Center for Arab-Eurasian Studies. Thank you all very much, and we hope to see you in future sessions. Goodbye.